So today, um, and Thursday, going into the next chapter, the depression and the depression and the new deal. Today we'll go into a little bit on really what we haven't really looked at. Is something that seems to be overlooked. Because last week we looked at the 1920s, right? The Roaring 20s. We saw the cultural phenomena that was the Roaring 20s. Some of you may have asked or answered that question, what made the 1920s so roaring? But for some, and that would mostly be those who were out there growing our food, and that was the farmers, the American farmer, or those who worked out on the fields. We'll talk a little bit about today, really what happened before the Great Depression, because really for them, in most respects, impact of the Depression wasn't necessarily there at the crash at the New York Stock Exchange in 1929, but mostly actually involved the status economically and, of course, agriculturally before that. It wasn't that great. But of course, it also exacerbated the issue with, or the impact really, of the Dust Bowl. So we'll get into a bit of that and really talk about water, and then we'll probably focus a little bit on one area, and perhaps I like to talk about just one specific area. We can probably, and that's Southern Colorado, Arkansas Valley, because it's really could be what we consider, just for this class, an example of how the impact of the Dust Bowl and Great Depression, then the New Deal. Thursday we'll get into New Deal, perhaps. Well, I'm sorry, we will. Okay. Okay. This week, you got to end it. Now, I think one or two of you already kind of did this annotated bibliography maybe last week. I'm not sure. Maybe I saw one or two. I'm not sure if that was from somebody else, another class. I'm not sure. This week is just doing an annotated bibliography. What is that? What do I mean by that? It's pretty simple. You take your primary source and your couple of secondary sources. You go ahead and type up your bibliography, and I showed you how to do that, Chicago Manual style. And then you just right below that, each source, you describe why and how, and you're going to use that source within your essay coming up. Well, this week and next week, as this week could be a draft. Okay. So you're going to focus on that first, and then you build, after you've done that, after you thought it out, then you go to your essay and draft it up, so to speak. All right. I want to get due on Thursday night. Okay. Why am I moving the deadline around a little bit? Because I want you have the opportunity, so I can look at it and send it back to you before midterm being due next Thursday, next week. Okay. Yeah, that's it for this. So if I got comments out there for you already, most of you, then that's you can build your. For some of you, I'm not sure whether or not this applies, or maybe it's a good idea to go ahead and just go back to where you were from the beginning, look at your previous assignments as far as your writing, and look at how far you've come in regards to your writing, minimum writing requirements. We started with one paragraph. I challenge you to some degree. Actually, it's something that might work as a good tool for you, is to take what you're going to write for your midterm and just go back to week one paragraph. Try to just summarize and get as far as you can into one paragraph. Now, it doesn't mean go past the 5 or 7 lines of text. Don't do that. Some of you, I believe, need to a little bit of use a cut. I won't say cut and paste, really just cut, and really need to condense down what you need to get to. Yeah, so try that. Then try 2 paragraphs and try to fit out what it is you can't put in 1 paragraph. And then you got that first idea, which is your second paragraph or so, and build that way. I mean, it might sound like a little much. So perhaps just go with what you feel comfortable with or confident in right now as far as your annotated bibliography. Like I mentioned, we'll talk about a little bit of this. Great Depression and New Deal really on Thursday. So let me go to this slide for now. What I don't have here, I want to back up a little bit and kind of connect a little bit with what we talked about on Thursday. Thursday? Yeah, Thursday. What was it I finished off with last Thursday? Do you remember? I remember. I'm just testing y'all quiz. We talked about the Roaring Twenties, right? What specifically did we talk about the Roaring Twenties? Talked about Flapper Girl? Is that what I talked about?
Yeah, we talked about Flapper Girl, and we also talked a lot about like the Jazz Age.
Okay. Yeah, we talked a little bit about that. I wanted to see how, in respect to how maybe some things are influencing each other. So surprisingly, impact of World War I, and then cultural impact on other areas. Like I said, we kind of went out beyond the borders of the U.S. and went as far as showing you the impact of who really was Flapper Girl. So who really is Flapper Girl, or who is what social or cultural movement? Is it more in regards to gender? What went on other than what the textbook says about Flapper Girl?
Like there was a cultural shift, like women were going out into the workplace, they were becoming more independent. They is basically, I think, a turn of this of like, I guess, how women were perceived or how they even saw themselves.
Okay. And so a lot of these came in, there are terms that we can describe for other than a more cultural aspect of the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age, particularly American women, not just American women. Could there have been, what did I show you guys on Thursday other than impact within the U.S.?
You showed us the Korean woman who wrote a story in Korea.
And what did she write about? To you call it, what made an opportunity for that girl, the Korean lady, to write a particular newspaper? What was it that provided the opportunity for her to write that?
She wrote about like if I were a man, and then like became a journalist in the Korean newspapers, right?
Okay, so yeah, really what happened was at this time, and believe it or not, I want to make sure you all don't get why are we still talking about this? Okay, we're gonna go, what's the best way to say it? yeah, I think we'll be able to connect the dot that you probably don't really will be surprised with, because we're going to shift back over to after World War One, the impact uh, World War One, but also back to the U.S. In some respects, and then get to the point to where next week really will be World War Two, right? So that's what I'm going to do today. On Thursday, mostly today, as far as going to World War II, believe it or not, because this impact is global. Okay, I'll let you try to hear me out. Okay, um, so really, let's talk about Flapper Girl culturally, but also then socially, and then gender. Okay, feminism, or where is the status of feminism at this time? Um, Really, we kind of saw that with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, um, defining that particularly, and defining for others as best as they could within limits that upon they could see. Um, sometimes we can see how they seem to see a little bit more when they're periphery. But of course, there's certain aspects of that got cases tunnel vision. What I mean by that is, well, in order for us to understand where they're at and looking at it, we got to see where they were historically and where the U.S. and any society was at that time. I'm sure y'all understand that just getting the constitutional amendment for the right for women to vote, 1920, was pretty significant, was a watershed moment, okay, benchmark as you want to say. But getting back to perhaps after World War One and the shift in cultural phenomena within the U.S., for example, we see other aspects legally and economically. Illegal constitutional amendment pushed out in 1919 to um, what was different in particular as far as the 18th Amendment and prohibition. What makes that unique with the rest of the amendments like the Bill of Rights or even the 19th Amendment with the right to vote? We know what we see here with the women's right to vote, that's a constitutional concern and equality right, particularly, and of being a citizen of the United States and voting. But what's the difference with prohibition? It's really, if you see all the other previous amendments and a little bit afterwards in the 20th century, what is it? Controlling something other or limiting the way we are socially or just our social habits. That's it. That's what it was. It's like controlling what we drink, what we consume, consumption. I mean, that's crazy if you look at it now. And it got to the point, well, they rescinded it later on, 1934 or something like that. All right, it was a complete failure because we're trying to control human behavior. But that's not what we're trying to do. Is that what the Constitution was for? To control human behavior at a more um, basic level other than constitutional and state and national. But anyways, let me get back to, well, no, that prohibition impacted the very space upon which the U.S., every citizen got to the point of um, that cultural phenomenon, right? The illicit economy that came about with organized crime, for example, and bootlegging, of course, and music and women, young women, and all that. We see the impact, though, as I showed you, with globally, or at least from modern Asia. So, with that being said, I just mentioned something very key there in modern Asia. Okay, so what's going to come about is within the aspect of Flapper Girl, really there's certain feminist ideologies that came about other than what was said in the US. And you saw that article that young Korean lady pushed out. Really, what was she doing? And that a lot of literature was pushed out. It was new woman, modern woman. Okay, these are things that were written up in the magazines. A lot of influence from the U.S., but then of course in um, Japan. Japan was modernizing, but as you see, we'll see in a moment, Korea also, because Korea became a Japanese colony in its most, in a modern sense, 20th century. Really, initially, they had pushed out military law, military rule. Of course, there was a huge riot. Oh gosh, yeah, 1919 or something like that, and they tried to calm down with cultural rule. So back up a little bit, or get our historical lens a bit further out, and look at the Pacific and the U.S. and then Japan, and believe it or not, in China. So I want to go ahead and let's see what's the biggest thing that I want to get to. So let's go back to World War I, or just shortly right after it. Let's go right after it. Okay, what was going on after World War I? So you can look at Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. Okay, what came about with the League of Nations? What was the intent of the League of Nations? Okay, other than the surrender in November 1918 with Germany, and I think last week I talked about just the fall of the Ottoman Empire, for example, which was the Middle East. And then, of course, most of what remained of colonies or colonization at that time in the Middle East, in Africa, and well, India, so the southern continent or subcontinent, and then, of course, Asia, East Asia. All right. There's still colonization. There was Britain. Britain was still relatively powerful, and they're starting to slow down a little bit. But after World War I, there was what was left of the Ottoman Empire and the mandates that were set up for that. And it wasn't just Britain, mostly Britain, a little bit of France, maybe a little bit of Italy too. But what came about, other than that, there's one other aspect that came about after the League of Nations, and that was actually with not just the defeat of Germany or Germany itself, but overall with the Allied powers, the ones that won, US, Britain, France, Western Europe, but also, believe it or not, those East Asia. So we came about with, I'll show you. Let me go in and just, believe it or not, maybe just even go to Wikipedia because I'm, yeah, why not? So kind of change things up a bit. All right. I know what some of you are about ready to say. Oh my gosh, he's going to Wikipedia. Okay, so yeah, you all see that, right? I'm sharing. So the results, the League of Nations, okay, other than just telling Germany give up their land, all right, just give it up. Really, there was limits essentially to themselves, because one of the goals was to never have any global war at all, to end all wars, right? This was the intent, because the impact was global as far as World War One. But believe it or not, so they got together after this, towards the 1920, early 1920. Other than League of Nations, it came together The Washington Naval Treaty was limiting the actual military equipment, mostly the ships, the warships, for each of these the Allied powers. And that would have been, let's see, went in Washington, D.C. in 1922. And it wasn't just Great Britain, United States, France, Italy, and Japan. Japan, I want you to focus on that real quick. Why? I think if you all break out your crystal ball or head yourself up with the next chapter, other than this week's, of course, we got World War II coming up. And my goodness, the impact on Germany and Europe, in Japan and Asia. Remember, World War II had really two fronts, okay, two theaters of war, right? In Europe, well, excuse me, sorry, Africa, Mediterranean, but eventually Europe, and of course the Pacific war theater. But here is the results of the attempt to limit the very equipment upon which the military would use for each nation, albeit other than Germany, for example. Really, we're trying to self-control here, including Japan. Japan, as you well know, was initially on board with this in the 1920s. But as you see by World War II, in Pearl Harbor, what happened in between them from 1922 in Japan and 1941, December 7th in Pearl Harbor, when they actually directly attacked. And I'm like, okay, so what happened there? That's 20 years. So I gave you a glimpse of what was going on with Japan. They really were like Korea and colonizing. Of course, they were on their way to occupy Manchuria and then make their way into China in 1930s. And hence the World War II really started in 1937 for Japan and China, 1937. But here we see a limitation on just battleships, battle cruiser aircraft carriers to try to stop any more. And the concept was, well, most of this may come up to on the ocean, right? I think they were looking in their crystal ball and say future war is going to look like it's going to be, on the ocean with the warships and the navies. And they were right, right? You see what happened in World War II. They saw already what Japan was trying to be. Okay. So really what happened here is culmination of military and political and global, all right? But let's go ahead and see how this came about with let's bring back the cultural aspect, like I said, with this. So how would this impact, can we connect this with cultural impact with what was going on in history in the US, okay? And what can we say about this? So let me get a couple of responses. Let me see if anybody's kind of got that space of 20 years connected yet. Well, we already know, let's go at least what we know, what we should be talking about this week, the Great Depression. All right. And then, of course, the Great Depression, then Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. All right. So we can probably just say this for Thursday or next week. All right. We don't have to go back. We don't have to go to it right now. Japan would become resentful late as they started. Well, basically, it was their invasion of Manchuria, just north of China. And Manchuria was the area upon which was a lot of resources, minerals, metals, and a lot of things to be able to build this, make the steel for the railroads. So that was one thing, railroad. And really that sense of their own imperialism. They in the space of 100 years or so, 150 years, they went 200 to be exact. Yeah, they were before like one of the most isolated nations earlier on. The samurai. I mean, we can generalize a little bit there. And from being just really aggressive in regards to their sense of empire and imperialism. Okay, Japan style, much influence. They mirrored and paralleled what the British and the U.S. have done as far as imperialism, empire. But anyways, let's go ahead, unless somebody's got something that can kind of connect that right now. If not, we'll go ahead and wait for Thursday or next week on that. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and I'm surprisingly whizzing through here this morning. Let's go ahead and talk about back to you. Let's talk about, let me try to maximize. Oh, let me stop. Okay, yeah. All right. Let's go ahead and back. And like I said, I mentioned at the beginning of class, as far as let's do a slow lead into the Great Depression and the New Deal. So, and this just really isn't just a textbook. We're looking at it. It's pretty much what textbooks are out there already over the last several decades. The portraying, still trying to figure out what caused the economic slowdown to such an after 1929 and through the 1930s. Okay, as we begin to see this, we'll start to see a shift in the powers of the central government and, of course, President Roosevelt, and, of course, politically, as far as the Democrat Party. All right. Before you see the 1930s and Roosevelt, we looked at I think that he's related, he is related to Teddy. I can't recall exactly how. They are related. I can't remember exactly. But Theodore Roosevelt had his version. That was progressivism. So I guess we can probably later talk about that difference between progressivism, Teddy Roosevelt, and then Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Okay. Really, I want to go before 1929. Okay. Really, we got to try to not take away as if it didn't happen. The New York Stock Exchange wasn't there and nothing happened and we just took it away and there was no crash on the stocks. It just started to, bottom out, really bottom out. A lot of speculation, but whether or not this economic downturn would have occurred without it. Quite frankly, what was going on out in the rural areas and the farms was pretty bad. Pretty bad. It really got to the point of it wasn't just stocks, it was pretty much commodities related to respective crops. All right. And of course, the demand for that, but all particular items within agriculture that were grown specifically for profit, not necessarily for the farmer and himself or family, or was grown there before, which you can consider indigenous to the land. And we can pick several regions of the U.S., for example, or even, believe it or not, Hawaii. Yeah, I'm sorry. For a minute there, I was thinking about Alaska, but I'm overthinking this. But So agriculturally, farmers were really going out there because of homesteading. Let's talk about that for a second. All right, homesteading would have been a concept of being healthy and wealthy. Let's go with wealthy. Well, the time was before the 1920s, through the turn of the 20th century, even the mid part of, or after the Civil War, you see settlement going towards the west. But of course, there was a Homestead Act in 1863, 64, something like that, that gave, you go out there, you farm the land, okay, and it's like 120 acres as a 1 square mile grid land. If you, for 3 years or something like that, and you improve the land, you got crops growing, you get a title to it, okay, from the federal government. So remember, before all this, with after Louisiana Purchase, the land was really belonging to the federal government. Even though settlers would go out there and just put their, mine, just extract something from the land, albeit anything out of the ground or from the river, a creek, or something like that, or even, well, we see how what the American South would probably be doing too, extraction of human labor. But anyways, let me get back to homesteading. So that's what they're basically doing, and just went out there. And then, of course, as the turn of the 20th century came about, a lot of the problems with moving out west, and one of the things that they started to slowly realize was one thing, or two things, excuse me, two things. One, that it's really dry out here. It really is. It's really dry. And whether or not we stay real close to the river, okay, the river plain, and the soil's reasonably fertile, okay, we got to be in those areas. Or two, we got to do something about moving water. Okay, but you remember, most of this is individual families. Basically, nuclear family. It might have been a couple of brothers or sisters that come out, their brothers and their families, for example, would come out. But it was just family based, right? But the idea was, well, shoot, for example, we could probably grow sugar beets and make sugar. Okay, there's one of the biggest ideas of cash crops. And Don, I hope you're not getting a sense of deja vu there.
Not really.
No. Oh, what? Okay, anyways. Cash crops, but in order to, like sugar beets, and to be able, because why? Because most of what sugar would come in would be from sugar cane, but that would have been imported from somewhere else. So somewhere down in the Caribbean, sugar cane, for example, sugar cane, or even, for example, Hawaii. But this was imported, and a lot of it belonged in other areas of the world, but it was exported from a foreign country. Whenever something comes in from some other than the U.S., there's always comes at a cost because of jobs and farm. The biggest one that had the biggest impact was the farmers, because you grow something. Are you growing it for yourselves? Are you growing it for who are you growing it for? And a lot of times, though, it became about you either stop what's coming in from a foreign country, or you don't stop it outright. You raise the taxes that are imported, okay? And when they do that, the prices of what's grown by the American farmer goes up, all right? But not within a more natural concept of, how much is it worth to feed your family? Or no, it would have been just subsidizing by the federal government within the concept of particularly grain, all right? Grain would be, of course, main staple. Of course, cotton. A lot of things would start to change though as these things would go away, specifically with textiles and not wool or cotton, things that would be synthetic, things that would replace wool, like I'm not sure, maybe I'm talking about later on. But anyways, um, initially, after the turn of the century, really I should back up a little bit within that period of time. From the late 19th century to early 20th century, there was startups as they settled west of fruit trees, fruit canning factories, canning industry, vegetables and tomatoes, and you name it, pickles. All right. But as we begin to see how we they shifted from more cash crop, that's really the term that can be used. A lot of this you can see within the very area of the southern Pueblo and southern Colorado and east to the Arkansas Valley. Of course, a good example is California and the Central Valley or San Joaquin Valley in between there, as far as agriculture and what came about, brought in. And so I'm not sure if I jumping around or not. I may have. Okay, so this would have gone past the homesteading. So really what's going on, there's a couple things going on other than, price of the very crop upon which you grow. And that was being able to grow something that's dry land, and that was the water beyond the scope of the river and the river plain. And of course, there's with after eventually within the 20th century, we begin to see how the water would become diverted, canals or ditches, but very still reasonably close to the rivers, the canals paralleling. A little bit further out, a lot of it was diverted for cattle. As you know, American diet was still involved meat. All right. But the sheep for wool, for example. But eventually, water became diverted in great distances. And those were the dams, the huge dams, huge tunnels, waters. What is required for this? A lot of consolidation of capital, okay? And what are you talking about? You're talking about federal government, you're talking about state government, beyond the scope of just the individual farmer or the family. It would be a pool of organizations that would, the banks, the railroad, and eventually particular water organizations, these huge dams. All right. This would occur up about to the 1920s. But of course, after 1929, that very structure, that very process Roosevelt would put on that and just expand it, and it would explode those programs because of the need for jobs. And so the capital was there, the equipment, the money, the loans borrowed, the subsidies from the federal government, and the shift in they're trying to keep the price of these cash crops reasonably high so the farmer can flourish. But there's all their other parts that there are certain crops that can grow without too much water. So I was dry land farming. All right. And that's going to lead into the Dust Bowl. Okay. So that's a really basic explanation of what the conditions, what was going on was the land itself. All right. The land itself there were problems. Other than the water, lots and lots of water is being diverted and putting that water on the dry land that's not used to being fed with a lot of water. reacts differently. And initially, there might be really a bountiful crop initially. Um, I think a lot of also just the weather itself, it kind of fooled everybody in regards, a lot of rain, just inexplicably, a lot of rain out there here in the West. Um, American South, you know what was going on there more socially, uh, economically, so or legally. So we see more of the social aspect of American South, and that's the continued limitations and African Americans being disenfranchised, the Jim Crow laws, and violence, direct violence towards them. But they they got to the point after Reconstruction to where they become still tied to the land and white owners, white farm owners, primarily still, because of change in the laws and really is still kind of a continuation of segregation. All right, and the African Americans would be sharecroppers. They'd be tenant farmers. They'd be tied to rent. They would then own the land. They would have to rent it, and essentially back to working for the white farm owner because of changes in like socially, legally, Jim Crow laws. You know, just aspects of um, really. It's how do we explain that? It's probably best to explain it here a little bit later on in regards to how the New Deal impacted them. So Thursday. Um, Northeast, as you see, since the Civil War has been primarily industry, heavy industry, and urban. Okay, with exceptions, of course, perhaps that area south of the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, um, Iowa, and the grain particularly. But um, I haven't really talked about too much about the Pacific Northwest. Um, that's the same deal to some degree as far as the water and the aridity. Um, I think so. The farmer by the time in 1929 um, was getting fooled by lots of rain and lots of land, getting out there and getting some land, individual farmers, but very sensitive to the change in the price of crops. And of course, there were a lot of speculation of those particular crops, either call them commodities uh, or futures. And there we can begin to tie in with the stocks and the crash there in the stock exchange in 1929. All right. Where with all the water that was supposedly coming and all the water that was diverted and um, that became part of that speculation. All right. But at the same time, there's a couple things that kind of happened at the same time, starting within 1929 and through the early 30s, was, well, droughts. The rain would all suddenly stop for extended amount of time. And then, of course, the changes within uh, prices of the crops being sold to either export um, or to other parts of the U.S. within the consumer market. As you see through the 1920s, there was a change in the consumer market. And of course, advertising, you see that where that, how do you think that image of the flapper girl or even the jazz age, the images projected out just with specific focus of images and symbols towards the consumer and affordable goods. All right. So you see a shift of rain running out. But there's one other aspect and one other thing. Even though lots of water being diverted to areas that need lots of water, okay, like sugar beets, for example. Let's just focus now on Arkansas Valley, for example. Okay, it got to point to, what's the second thing? Okay, yeah, no, let's go southeast, okay? Let's go southeast from southern Colorado. And what that means is the Oklahoma, and then the Midwest, northern part of Texas, and then you've got Kansas and Nebraska, and maybe a little bit of Missouri. But stick to Oklahoma, for example. They moved out to the land there, homesteading. Oklahoma is a little different, right? Because of the land rush. I should have talked about that a couple weeks ago. Making excuses. The land. You went out there with their plows and essentially turned upside down the my recording. Yeah. They turned the soil upside down. Okay, and remember what I said, initially the soil reacts to water initially pretty well. Okay, and it's reasonably fertile at that time. But essentially it was the extent and the amount of the land that was turned upside down. It was most of it. Now remember most of also it's not just arid, it's the prairie land of the Midwest. Remember back in the day in the 19th century, early part, there were millions of herds of buffalo. So it was prairie and grassland. Of course, it took maybe thousands of years for that grass to develop and grow and survive without much water. Okay. So you can kind of see what's the content, the consistency of soil for that to happen. Okay. And have the buffalo constantly eating grass, millions of them, but the grass still grows back. Can look at it that way. And then man comes out and it turns over with his plow. Now, eventually, much of that would be modernized with tractors and plows, more blades to turn over that soil and grow something. It became to the point to where much of the land was owned by those out east, and became they would hire other farm families, and they would then become tenant farmers. All right, and the ones that owned the land, like I said, would just keep hanging out east. They didn't come over to check out their land because it was part of that it was land speculation also in the 1920s and earlier. Okay, because prices just kept going up and they would make money off of it. All right. But eventually the rain stopped a lot, somewhere around the early 1930s. And then, of course, what's going on here, the land needs a rest. The land that you farm that's usually not getting much water, okay, you totally destroyed the subsurface, and no longer is the grass growing, it's growing nothing else other than this for other cash crop for a couple of seasons. Even if there was a lot of rain, underneath this silt, sand, okay, underneath the whatever few inches of actual fertile soil and the grass, the little insects or whatever, animals that kind of transfer stuff around to kind of keep the grass growing. Yeah, that's my official historical term I'm going to use. Yeah, so the rain stopped, and then of course the winds started picking up because the heat, and that really the extent of the transfer and compromise of the dirt and the land was within a huge region in the Midwest, including the southeast portion of Colorado, like Baca County. And then in Panhandle, Oklahoma, into Oklahoma, northern part of Texas, perhaps, even out towards Midwest, Kansas and Nebraska, perhaps a little bit of North Dakota, or South Dakota, excuse me. but all the wind picked up, but it picked up all that millions of square miles. And by 1934 or so, there were becoming dust storms. And of course, now you see how speculation kind of came to a dead halt in 1929. So it wasn't just necessarily the stocks themselves, it was speculation connected to agriculture and the farmers and the water, okay, and the hosts who control the water. That's probably my best explanation for today. What other aspects? So we can continue to talk about other groups that were out there on the fields working. All right. As we get closer to the aspects of the Great Depression, the New Deal, it would have a huge impact on labor and the defining of labor, much in industry, of course, but also in agriculture. And really, agriculture would be kind of also where groups continue to be discriminated against, particularly Mexican Americans, well, at least within certain areas of the country. And of course, we'll start to see the impact. Hopefully, the textbook talks about the South at the time too. But could you see that this problem it was nationwide, as far as millions of people losing their jobs, and banks just losing all their whatever money was deposited by Americans. So that's where the speculation and then the money that was saved up, the cash, became pretty much worthless, or inflation just went really, really high. And you see rushes to the bank trying to withdraw their money. Well, there was no money left. So that's a basic, rather crude explanation of farmers' status there. So maybe some of your family has been impacted directly by events of this part of the 20th century. Probably like for my grandparents, for example, yeah. And whether or not since we have or influence on us personally, I'm not sure. But anyways,